This webinar will present the results of a recent study that we completed. We call it the Global Transportation, Energy, and Climate Roadmap. And it's an evaluation of the impact of transportation policies on worldwide oil consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, and the potential for these policies to reduce these emissions by 2030. The analysis is based on our roadmap model, which is an Excel-based public tool, which is also available on our site. We use the best available data for global and national transportation emissions, and then we use it to identify and project trends and to illustrate the implications of different policy scenarios. This is the first of a planned series of webinars, and they will include in-depth sessions on the model itself and presentations of other modeling analysis, such as the health impacts of on-road vehicle emissions. Let me start by introducing the International Council on Clean Transportation. Some of you might be familiar with us already. We are a research organization. We focus on vehicle technologies, both to improve efficiency and reduce emissions of local air pollutants. And to inform our technical work, we work together with governmental agencies in the major vehicle markets that account for about 85% of new vehicle sales. So we're very active in China, in Europe, in the US, in Japan, Brazil, India, Canada, South Korea, and Mexico. And when we deal with policymakers in these different countries, we look for direction on where to concentrate our research efforts, and in turn, we provide technical capacity to them. Currently, we're about 40 staff members, both with technical and regional focus. And to complement this regional work that we do, we also work on global studies to communicate the importance of transportation policies and to enable country comparisons and the sharing of international best practices. So this study that we're presenting today is one of such studies. So when we started doing a literature review of roadmap type of studies, we obviously found a wealth of information, but also that most of the previous studies that were based on a backcasting approach. So based on a specific reduction target to limit temperature increases, we had to reduce transportation emissions by a certain percentage. And we realized that none of the studies provided what the policymakers that we support were asking about, which is what can these national governments do in the near term to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. Then after this, we went into more detailed questions to properly frame the study. The first one was, how far have adopted policies taken us in terms of the reduction of oil consumption and greenhouse gas emissions? What are the policies in the pipeline, and how far will they take us? How much more can we expect from transportation policies in the near term? Or in other words, what is the additional potential of transportation policies? How do countries compare in terms of policy progress? And finally, what do these near-term reductions mean for long-term climate goals? So to properly frame the study to answer these questions, we realized that we had to focus not only on key regions, but on key modes. So in these two charts, we can see global transportation energy consumption in millions of barrel oil equivalent per day. The top chart by country and the lower chart by mode. So in terms of countries, we focus on the largest vehicle markets, and we have individual policy assessments in the report for US, China, Europe, India, Brazil, Japan, Canada, Mexico, South Korea, and Australia. And the remaining countries were aggregated into larger regional groups, including the Asia Pacific, Europe, Latin America, Middle East, and Africa. So all in all, the study covers all the countries, but with obviously different levels of aggregation. In terms of modes, we focus the study on those modes that are responsible for the majority of emissions, especially light-duty and heavy-duty vehicles, which are evaluated at the country/regional level, but also aviation and marine, which are handled in the study at the global level. And they cover both domestic and international movements, with aviation covering only passenger movements and marine covering only freight movements, which are the majority of the activity. Bus, two and three-wheelers, and as well as rail were also included at the country and regional level. So all modes were included, possibly with only the exception of off-road. Still, in terms of the report scope, it's also important to focus on different broad types of strategies. So the basic framework, we divided the strategies into the avoid, shift, and improve. The avoid being the reduction or the avoidance of the need to travel. The shift being the shift or the maintenance of the share of more environmentally friendly modes. And the improve is the energy efficiency, to improve the energy efficiency of these transportation modes. And we considered a few different strategies for each of these three categories. And some examples are on-road efficiency improvements, which fall under the improve category. But there are also other types of strategies that fall somewhere between the avoid and shift, or both. They have both characteristics of avoid and shift, such as land use planning, travel demand management, or fiscal measures, for example. So if we look at the global trends in transportation greenhouse gas emissions, we see that a lot of progress has already been made, but a lot more is possible and necessary. So in this chart, we are going to see different policy trajectories from the year 2000 to the year 2030 in terms of annual well-to-wheel greenhouse gas emissions at the global level. So the first policy trajectory that we evaluated, we call it the reference trajectory, which assumes no policies adopted after 2000. It's a virtual trajectory, which means that it's intended only to be used to quantify the reductions from the adopted trajectory, which is the red line. This one includes existing, enforceable, and finalized regulations, but assumes no further changes. An example of an adopted policy are the US fuel efficiency standards. They're both light duty and heavy duty as well. Then beyond adopted policies, we also consider the policies that are in the pipeline, which are those under active regulatory development or that exist as formal stated policy goals. An example is in Europe, the 95 grams of CO2 per kilometer for light-duty vehicles, given that it's been proposed, but it hasn't been officially adopted yet. Another example are transit investments that encourage mode shift that have been only partially funded. And then finally, we consider the blue trajectory, which is the policy potential, which goes beyond those that have been adopted and that are in the pipeline, and includes technically feasible and cost-effective policies and consider plausible regulatory timelines, but without the consideration of any political will. In terms of savings, adopted policies will have a significant impact on both on greenhouse gas emissions and oil consumption from the transportation sector. And if adopted to current expectations, the policies in the pipeline will augment these reductions. So together, adopted and pipeline policies will reduce global economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 7% and global oil consumption by 14% in 2030. And if we look into the policy potential, we realize that the expansion of world-class policies and cost-effective technologies across the world, and that includes both vehicle efficiency, mode shift, and activity reduction policies, would essentially stabilize greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020. So when we talk about, there's been a lot of talk about peaking of emissions. And based on our study, the peaking could occur if we maximize the policy potential by 2020, at least in the transportation sector. And if we consider all the policies together, the reductions are equivalent to 13% of global GHGs and 28% of global oil consumption in the year 2030. It's also important to look at the results of this study by mode. And in this case of light-duty vehicles, they include passenger vehicles such as cars, minivans, and sporty utility vehicles, as well as light commercial vehicles. And they really have the strongest track record for regulatory policy. So in this chart, we can see global GHG emissions from the light-duty sector from 2000 to 2030, and the different wedges, they represent savings from specific policies. Let's focus on the brown, the purple, the red, and part of the cream wedges. They all represent adopted policies. So if these policies, they have the intended effects, those wedges are actually not going to be there because they're actually savings that have already been adopted. They really represent and demonstrate the full benefits of regulatory action and the rapid penetration of cost-effective technologies. So in the United States, if we have a little bit of a historical perspective, there has been a successful initial response to the global oil crisis of the 70s. But then after that, the energy regulations for vehicles stagnated for many years, and the fleet average efficiency has stayed relatively constant. So technological improvements have been made, but instead of being made to improve the efficiency, they were made to make vehicles larger and more powerful. And it was only in the past decade, and especially in the past 5 years, that the largest vehicle markets resumed ambitious fuel efficiency and greenhouse gas standards for vehicles. Currently, these standards, they are in effect for over 70% of the global new vehicle market, and they drive the development and introduction of new energy efficient technologies, such as smaller engines, lighter vehicles, and improved aerodynamics and tires. For these policies, we can see by the size of these wedges that the US progress, as well as the European and Chinese progress, are actually quite substantial. And they are expected to improve the efficiency by anywhere from 45 to 50% between 2000 and 2025. So that really means that in the US, at least, it means that a new vehicle in 2025 will be twice as efficient as a vehicle in 2000. So that's quite a lot. And we can see that without these standards, the CO2 emissions and oil consumption could have almost doubled between 2000 and 2030. And in essence, the continual improvement in fuel efficiency is required to offset the expected growth in passenger vehicle fleets and activity around the world. Let's now focus on the light green wedge. This represents transit investments that are in the pipeline. And we partnered with the Institute for Transportation Development and Policy, the ITDP, to conduct a project-by-project analysis of transit investments. That included more than 100 projects in the major regions that we've evaluated. So we evaluated both funded and partially funded transit projects and made estimates of the levels of mode shift involved. This was indeed a very challenging analysis because it's difficult to isolate the effects of these investments with the desired results as mode shift. So therefore, there is the uncertainty in this part of the analysis inherently a little higher. As far as the blue wedges, they both represent potential policies. The quantifying the vehicle efficiency potential was made by taking the annual rate of improvement in vehicle efficiency achieved under best practices in the US, Europe, and China, extending it beyond current timelines and planning regulations, and applying this rate of improvement to regions that currently lack these standards. We focus on cost-effective technologies with payback periods of less than 5 years. And because it takes a relatively long time for these policies to be implemented, the potential to improve vehicle efficiency, we assume that these policies come no sooner than 2015 for the regions highlighted in this report, and 2020 for the other aggregated regions in this report, leaving a somewhat limited time window for these policies to take effect because they only affect the new fleet and not the entire fleet. The analysis of mode shift and activity potential is illustrated by the blue striped wedge. And the rate of progress for current mode shift projects is assumed that to be magnified based on our project by project analysis in the pipeline. So in this analysis, we assume that whatever progress we had in the pipeline will multiply that by 3. So in effect, the potential is assumed to be proportional to the current track record of transit investments. In terms of activity reduction, we assumed that certain policies such as travel demand management or land use planning would reduce the average trip length in urban areas, going incrementally up to 5% by 2030. And we can see that the impact of potential activity strategies, including both mode shift and the activity side, can place light-duty vehicle emissions on a much faster downward trajectory, resulting in emissions in 2030 that are actually lower than the emissions in 2000. Also wanted to make a remark here about electric vehicles, that even though they play somewhat of a minor role in the time frame of the study up to 2030, their importance is really going to happen a lot further after 2030. So it's important that we set the stage for the eventual large-scale adoption of electric drive vehicles. So based on our analysis, the policies of transportation, both on the vehicle efficiency, mode shift, and activity reduction, they have the potential to reduce emissions in 2030 by up to 50%. So in the case of heavy-duty vehicles, and those includes both heavy-duty trucks and buses, the combination of high activity growth and the lack of regulatory progress means that we can see much higher heavy-duty vehicle emission growth rates. Because of the strong growth in truck activity, especially in emerging markets such as China and India, it is expected that heavy-duty vehicle emissions will more than double in the absence of mitigation policies. If we compare the heavy-duty sector with the light-duty sector, we see that national efficiency standards for heavy-duty vehicles have a much briefer regulatory history than for light-duty. And part of the reason is because setting these standards is a lot more challenging than for light-duty vehicles, because the fleet is extremely diverse in terms of vehicle size, configuration, but also user patterns. The standards have just begun to be proposed and adopted in some of the major vehicle markets in the world, but even the first of the standards have not yet been implemented yet. And as a result, the anticipated reductions from these policies are not nearly enough to offset the increase in emissions that would occur. Let's look at the different policies, and starting by the red wedges, which represent the adopted policies. Japan was the first country to introduce these efficiency standards on a national basis in 2005, but they will only take effect until in 2015. However, we can already see that a lot of manufacturers have already met these targets early, because Japan has also introduced fiscal incentives for early compliance. The US finalized heavy-duty efficiency standards in 2001, and those will apply to vehicles starting in model year 2014. Canada has also recently approved standards equivalent to the US, and Mexico is currently conducting active discussions to do the same. Europe has adopted standards for light commercial vehicles, but nothing for the heavier classes that account for a much larger share of activity emissions and oil consumption. And China adopted an industry standard for HDV efficiency in 2011, and has proposed a national standard for heavy-duty vehicles. We can see from this chart that the China HDV efficiency phase 1 can actually reduce emissions by quite a lot, given the expected growth in Chinese heavy-duty emissions. Now, let's focus on the blue wedges, which are the potential. So despite the relatively small benefits from policies adopted to date, there's substantial potential to reduce emissions through vehicle efficiency, mode shift, and activity reduction policies and strategies. Let's focus on the vehicle efficiency potential first, which is the solid blue wedge. We've looked into technical studies, both in Europe and in the US, and they have shown that there is a potential for a 40 to 50% reduction in fuel consumption rates for most types of heavy-duty vehicles. The payback periods, they vary quite a lot in terms of both by regulatory design, vehicle type, or regional specific activity patterns. But the typical time frame for payback periods is from 1 to 4 years. So they're relatively cost effective. So when we assumed the specific improvements for this trajectory, we assumed a 3.5% improvement, annual improvements for all new heavy-duty classes. And because of the longer regulatory time frame associated with developing these standards, this analysis assumes that these measures would only take in effect in 2020 for the regions highlighted in this report, and in 2025 for the other regions. So we can see that the benefits of these improvements will really only take full effect a lot after 2030. So we can not really see a lot of the effects in this chart. So with respect to mode shift and activity reduction, which is the striped blue wedge, there's lack of data on freight projects, and this made the analysis a bit more theoretical and based on assumptions. So what we did is we divided regions between those with extensive rail infrastructure and those with little rail infrastructure to determine the potential for rail traffic increases. So the idea was that on the regions with potential for moderate shift, we assumed an increase in rail activity by 20% by 2030, progressively increasing to 20%. And for those regions with aggressive mode shift, we increased the rail activity progressively up to 40%. And we assume that this increase in rail activity is, quote unquote, stealing traffic from long distance trucking. In terms of activity reduction, we assume that logistics improvements can happen, and they could go up to a 5% in the reduction of activity by 2030. And if we look broadly at all of these trajectories, we can see that vehicle efficiency potential combined with mode shift and activity reduction could offset the growth in vehicle activity and stabilize and start reducing HDV emissions after 2025. And the potential, if we add all of these policies, is a reduction of 30% in 2030 compared to a scenario without these policies in place. It's also important to focus on those sectors that fall beyond the intervention of national governments, which are the marine and aviation sectors. If we evaluate the change in fuel efficiency for marine vessels, we can see that they improved substantially until the year 2000, both through engine improvements, but also with ship architecture improvements. And after 2000, ship efficiency improved very little and kept improving very little over the following decade. And that was both because of very high freight prices and a dramatic demand for maritime trade. So we can actually see that the marine sector offers a really nice opportunities for emission reductions. So the evaluation of policies in the marine sector was developed primarily at the global level. And for the most part, these policy discussions have been held within the International Maritime Organization, which is the IMO. If you look into the adopted policies represented by the red wedge, the Energy Efficiency Design Regulation, the EEDI, was approved in July of 2011 by the IMO, and will require large new ships to be 10% more efficient beginning in 2015, 20% more efficient by 2020, and 30% more efficient in 2025, with somewhat smaller improvements to smaller ships. The pipeline trajectory, which is represented by the green wedge, consider main measures under active discussions, and those involve a variety of options to increase the operational in-use efficiency of the marine fleet. So to investigate the full potential of these possibilities, this analysis relied on several IMO assessments that resulted from various market-based measures under consideration. So we looked into 6 proposals that ranged all the way from fuel levies that would fund out-of-sector GHG reduction initiatives, all the way to cap-and-trade systems that would raise and spend money entirely within the shipping sector based on the efficiency of new ships. To simplify the analysis, we consider only in-sector emission reductions because they would not deal with the set of an administration, such as a climate fund that would deal with out-of-sector reductions. So we thought that it would be, the analysis would be simpler. But on the other hand, the in-sector reductions, they're considerably smaller than the out-of-sector reductions, which is why you see the green wedge being relatively small, as well. So that part of the analysis was somewhat conservative. So beyond the adopted and pipeline policies, the sector obviously has further potential, which is the blue wedge. So the SEMP policy, which is the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, even though it has been adopted already, it's not enforceable. So we consider that in the potential trajectory instead. And it established mechanisms for reducing the fuel consumption through improvement in ship operational practices. It's not prescriptive, so it assigns flexibility to the carriers on the best ways to meet that plan. So one example is weather routing, to determine the optimal routing based on weather conditions. They can also manage their speeds to avoid port congestion and reduce fuel consumption, which is a concept that is termed virtual arrival. They can also optimize the propeller inflow or clean the hull of the ship more frequently, and both of the strategies can reduce resistance during navigation. Part of the reason why we included it here is that there are efforts to strengthen the SEMP policy with systems such as audit and monitoring systems and the removal of market barriers. Another way that makes us feel confident that there could be potential here is that increasing fuel prices and pressure to keep the freight down also mean that there's a market incentive for firms to comply with the SEMP. A lot of technical studies in this area have also indicated that a lot of the strategies are also cost effective, which is consistent with the analysis that we have done for the heavy duty and the light duty sector. And all in all, if we look into the potential reductions in 2030, these policies, both adopted pipeline and potential, could reduce marine emissions by 25% compared to a scenario without these policies in place. It's also important to look into the aviation sector, since it's the one expected to have the highest rate of growth amongst all the transportation modes. And greenhouse gas emissions from the aviation sector are expected to roughly double from 2010 to 2030. And contrary to conventional wisdom, rising fuel costs have not translated directly into increased fuel efficiency for new jet aircraft. And if we look into the improvements in the past decade, they have been mostly inconsistent. However, the ICAO research suggests that there is potential to improve new aircraft efficiency through 2030, and that potential is considerably higher than what we have observed. The strategies to reduce aviation emissions are typically categorized in 4 types. One of them is improvements in aircraft technology, both in engine aerodynamic and structural improvements, such as lightweight materials. The other type is aircraft activity, such as market-based measures. We can also see improvements in operations, for example, in better air traffic control and also in low carbon fuels. Since the aviation industry is fundamentally global in scale, the policy assessment for the aviation sector is also developed at the global level. But because of some policies that have been adopted already, we have a look at the regional level as well because of Europe. And the discussions of energy efficiency for near aircraft have mostly been held within the International Civil Aviation Organization. So let's look at the adopted wedge. I just talked about Europe. The European Union in 2012 began incorporating both domestic and international flights into its regional cap and trade system. So we included that as an adopted policy. Obviously, because you're only talking about a regional policy, it doesn't show very much on the chart. In terms of pipeline policies, we consider both global market-based measures and a CO2 standard. So in terms of market-based measures, in the same scope as the European program, ICAO is considering a global framework for market-based measures, and those would use an open cap and trade system or an offsetting mechanism to internalize the cost of carbon and to raise funds for reductions in other sectors where reductions might be less costly. And these market-based measures, they assume a 2.9% reduction in demand in aviation activity from higher ticket prices. So as I said, the other policy that we consider in the pipeline is an ICAO CO2 standard, which is under development, and it's scheduled for proposal in 2013. It aims to reduce emissions by increasing the rate of improvement in new aircraft by promoting the deployment of more efficient engines, improved aerodynamics, and lightweight materials. The blue wedges, what they essentially do is that they take the policies included in the pipeline and make them more aggressive, which is why you see that the savings are somewhat magnified. And if we look all in all in the aviation sector, the transportation policies have somewhat of a more limited impact than in the other sectors. So they're not able to offset as much as the activity, the growth in activity. And they are expected, or they could reduce aviation emissions by 18% in 2030. Let's now have a look at these results by region. So we can see that China, the US, and Europe have really taken the lead in driving these emission reductions from the transportation sector. And they're really responsible for almost 70% of the expected emission reduction. In this chart, we can see 2 variables for each country. The one within the rectangles are the absolute value of GHG reductions in 2030, and the percentage on top is the reduction in percentage terms, also in 2030. And we can see that the reductions, they vary in the regions that we analyzed, all the way from 7% to 33%. And those include only adopted and pipeline policies. So those do not include the potential ones. And if we look into the aviation and the marine sector, we could expect reductions of 8 and 15%. In the study that we completed, we also evaluated specific vehicle markets. So we evaluated the policy trajectories, and here we're including the examples of US and China. And we can see a few important elements in these two charts. The first one being the specific rates of growth in terms of emissions. You could see the US, because of the adopted policies, which are the red wedges, they have essentially flat emissions over time until 2030, while China, because of much higher growth rates, can expect increasing emissions. The other element is we can really see that the US has been very active in the past few years in terms of adopting policies, while China has both adopted policies on the light duty sector, but has also a lot of policies in the pipeline as well. If we add all of the transportation policies, including the potential, we could see that the US has a much faster decreasing trend with emissions in 2030 that could be significantly lower than the year 2000. And in China, if we maximize the policy potential, we could stabilize, but not quite start reducing transportation emissions as yet, at least not until 2030. So in terms of broad conclusions from this study, the first one is that adopted policies will have a very significant impact in the reduction of oil consumption and GHG emissions. And then the policies in the pipeline will pretty much double these reductions. The second conclusion is that the expansion of world-class policies and cost-effective technologies across the world, including vehicle efficiency, mode shift, and activity reduction policies, would essentially stabilize transportation emissions by the year 2020. But that to constrain, that despite these large emission reductions, these policies will not put the transportation sector on a trajectory to constrain the temperature increases by 2 degrees Celsius, which IPCC had indicated that we're 5% by 2050 from 2000 levels. And for you to enable that, to constrain temperature increases to 2 degrees Celsius, significant policy progress beyond 2030 is required, together with a transformation of the transportation sector with new technologies such as electric drive vehicles and dramatic shifts in how people and freight move. Before we open up to questions, I'd like to have a view or give a preview of 2 webinars that we have in the pipeline as well. The first one being the roadmap model, which is a tool behind this analysis and that is already available on our site. And the second one is the roadmap health report, which is the counterpart of the report that we just presented, but will focus on the potential and the impact of policies to reduce health impacts and emissions of local air pollutants. I'd like to thank you for your presence, and for more information you can access our site or also contact myself directly or Josh at the emails that are on screen right now. We will now open up to questions and answers. So if you click on the button to raise your hand, we'll open up the microphone. Well, as I see no questions, this concludes our presentation and questions and answers for today. I'd like to thank both Josh Miller and Sarah Keller for their help in organizing the webinar. The webinar recordings will be made available on our website, so if you know of anyone who hasn't been able to join us, please tell them about the recordings. If you have any additional questions afterwards, you feel free to send us over email as well. And I'd like to thank you for your participation.
Cristiano.
And have a good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, depending on where you are. Thank you. This concludes.